TRIBE version 2 is an open source brain activity predictor from Meta. And I know that sounds super crazy. It's not a chatbot or some LLM. It's not some sort of Google machine. What it actually does is it simulates different parts of the brain, and it was produced by running several neurological trials. And by several, I mean 720 people went through fMRI machines, functional magnetic resonance imaging machines, and it distilled all of their, I guess, brain functions, right? The mappings, what caused their brains to fire. Doesn't sound super scientific, but basically they're creating a mental model of how people respond to images and text as they're going through these MRI machines. So what does that mean in terms of what we're doing for marketing here, just to be specific? Well, glad you asked. There's 5 brain regions that this particular this particular model, I guess, or data set was trained on. So we have language comprehension, executive attention, conflict monitoring, semantic integration, and reward valuation. So what do these 5 parts of the brain represent? These 5 parts of the brain represent cognitive load under language comprehension. So that's thinking, right? Think. Thanks for looking at my poor handwriting. But how hard the brain works to decode words. Then you have executive attention, right? So focus, sustained focus. How long, or how does the hook land, right? How does it hold? Reward valuation. Reward valuation is pretty much the promise. So after going through the content, after experiencing what is being shown or communicated, how did it land? How did it stick? How sticky is that communication towards that individual? Then you have conflict monitoring. Conflict monitoring is pretty interesting. It's basically, do I feel like I'm being sold to? Do I like the message? Does it resonate with me? I'm just going to write sales because that's funny. And then semantic integration. So like narrative coherence, right? Is the thing Edward Chalupa said at the beginning of this video, does that make sense by the time we land at the end of this video? I sure hope so. So let's just say story. I like story. Story's a fun way of interpreting that. So when we take these 5 parts of the brain and we put them all together, we create data sets around them. We can then inference a lot of that data by using a large language model. Pretty cool. So what I've done for my own work, for what I'd like to consider maybe basic application, is I'm running headlines and CTAs through the TRIBE model. You could do it through body copy as well, but I think that's a little maybe overkill. And to make sure we're really specific here, TRIBE is a data set, and you have to run it through a trained model that Meta has produced called Llama 3.2 3B. Those 3 billion models, those 3B models, sorry if you can't see that, those models are fairly small. You should be able to run it on your computer. I'm able to run it on my Potato of a Mac Mini. I believe I have some code that you can throw at the specific model itself, so that way you can configure it in such a way that you can better run it off your CPU, because you might not have enough GPU, you might not have enough RAM, you might not have enough money to run this in a most optimal way. So if you are running Potato quality, if you're part of Potato Nation, you are going to be using the CPU, and you're going to need to use this 3.2 3B model. I tried different models. You really need to use the one that Meta has designed this for. So I just need to kind of put that little asterisk there. So taking simply the headline and the CTA, we'll run that through TRIBE paired with Llama 3.2, and it will develop 5 ROI scores and 3 composites. I'll touch on that here in a moment. and I have that running as a nightly batch, really morning batch, depending who you are. I'm a 5 a.m. person these days. At 5:30, we'll go over my planned content in the pipeline for it to go over several headlines and CTAs, in which we'll then populate some content around. Touch on that more in a second. And then the no-code DB content, that's just where I store my content. That's where I plan. That's how I build pipeline. It's basically an Airtable for those who are familiar with Airtable, or you could consider it like an Asana. So your 5 ROI scores. The 5 ROI scores in this case are part of that whole brain mapping we went over. So coming over here again, language comprehension, executive attention, conflict monitoring, semantic integration, and reward valuation. We assign scores to each of those through TRIBE, and those are scores that each of those vectors are placing based on the proposed CTA and the proposed headline. Those scores in particular, based on those 5 vertices, look at that, fancy words, I don't know, you're able to come up with these 3 composite formulas. These 3 composite formulas, let's see if I can shift over here to my outline, consist of engagement, clarity, and conversion. For engagement, it takes 3 of your total vertices, so to speak, and has these weighted averages to present on a recommendation based on how each of those have scored. So attention, reward, semantic in the case of engagement. And we're just seeing how we're going to best capture the attention, capture the interest, and making sure that we're able to stabilize or hook people into the actual content. Clarity is touching on, once again, ease, semantic, this low friction, really hitting that sort of like the semantic integration part of the brain. If the reader doesn't understand the words, nothing matters. True. And then conversion, right? So reward, low friction, attention. Did we fulfill on that promise we were talking about earlier? Did we hit the reward valuation? Conflict monitoring's in there a little bit too. We don't want too much friction. These are all terms that you probably are familiar with as well. If you're in any kind of revenue ops, you don't want friction, don't want to place too much friction on the buyer or the consumer in this case. So with these composite formulas, we're able to essentially determine scores, right? We have a score that's set on the initial CTA and headline, and then we'll have a score based on a proposed new CTA and headline as well. So in this example, we're looking at 0.72 versus 0.38, and we're looking at the total average on that specific output. So across those 5 vertices, right? That then go into the composites, engagement, clarity, and conversion, which then we can run it through an LLM. Sorry, minced my words a little bit there, but you get the idea. We're putting it through, you could run it through Llama 3.2, 3B to get that recommender output. You could run it through Claude if you so choose. At this point, it's being intercepted by a model of your choice to help produce a specific recommender output. Okay, so we touched on the 5 ROI scores, the 3 composites, and then our final recommender. You'll notice that I have quadrant matching here. This is if you want to be extra or spicy or 110%. And for me, what I like to do is I like to squirrel away all of the data, all of the findings, all of the research that I have done over CTAs and headlines for the course of, months, years in this case. And I want to be able to quickly look back on the split testing that I've done to determine over time, what is the aggregate, what is the consistency, or how has the TRIBE version 2, or how has the TRIBE improvements done over X amount of time. So I just want to be able to use semantic recall, which is quadrant, it's RAG, for a quick approximation of the trends as it relates to the well-performing CTAs and headlines that I have produced. Hopefully that makes sense. And that might be a little overkill. You don't need to have that in your mix. You just kind of need the AI recommender, which could be, again, your llama model, or Claude, whatever you want. But just know that this is sort of your output. So really, we knocked out that step 2. Here's a quick little recap of the variant showdown. Marketers, we split test everything, right? What's better, chocolate or vanilla? We'll test it. In this case, that's specifically what we're doing here. So through the AI output, that last step that we went through, we're then going to determine a winner. So variant A and variant B, okay? So variant A, in this case, would be the score. It would be what we had run through Tribe, and we're determining, okay, this did well across the vertices, the 5 points, and then based on the composite formula, it's giving us an approximated, conversion of 0.72, and this scale goes from 0 to 1. So 0.72 is a significant improvement based on something maybe that would have been your initial. So our agency builds high converting pages, 0.38. So why A wins? I think we're looking at a difference on the reward tangent here of 0.62. I should have put together the initial prompt before I had going into this, but like your initial input or the graded input was our agency builds high converting pages. Bear with me, folks, as I'm still building out content pipelines, but basically that's scored on the reward scale, 0.28, not very great. And then friction was a lot lower for the variant A and variant B based on Tribe's prescribed output. So again, what's nice about this system is we are assigning essentially evals or evaluations to the actual content that we're putting through. We're making more data-driven decisions around content, which is inherently or consistently historically been a flaw with content. We want to make things measurable, and this is one way of doing that. I know that this is sort of a rudimentary application. I think there's a lot more interesting and more advanced applications of going about doing this. But what makes things really interesting is when you start taking data models and applying them towards a multivariate of essentially algorithms or statistical models, then you start coming up with some really unique data or outputs, and that's something you can do at scale with these LLMs. Another example would be taking something that I've been working on, but taking Monte Carlo style statistical analysis and applying it towards financial data and seeing what something like Claude can do with that to trade actively on markets. That's just one of the many ways that you can essentially take and synthesize knowledge and apply it towards real world outputs. So I'd love to see what any of y'all can do with this sort of style, this approach, this method. I want to see some comments, some likes, whatever it is. I just want to get a dialogue going. I'd love to see what you guys are building, what you're brewing. Until next time, see you later.